The cold of that December morning was a physical thing. It was a presence in the foxhole, a thief that stole the warmth from a man's bones, leaving behind an ache that settled deep in the marrow. In the forests of the Ardennes, the silence was just as profound. It was a silence made of a million tiny sounds: the sigh of wind through the snow-dusted pines, the distant crack of a frozen branch, the soft thump of a clump of snow surrendering to gravity. For the American GIs holding this quiet sector of the line, it was the sound of a war that seemed to be winding down, a war that would surely be over by spring. They were told this was the ghost front, a place to rest, to refit, to dream of a Christmas back home. In a shallow hole scraped from the frozen Belgian earth, a 19-year-old private from Ohio listens to that silence. He is cold, he is bored, and he is thinking about a girl whose picture is tucked inside his helmet liner. He doesn't hear the first shell. No one ever hears the one that lands closest, he only feels it. It is not a sound but a concussion, a violent, world-ending fist that punches the air from his lungs and lifts him from the ground. Then comes the noise. It is not the familiar intermittent crump of mortar fire or the angry chatter of a machine gun. It is a roar, a constant, rolling Niagara of sound that shreds the silence and tears the sky apart. It is the sound of 1,000 German artillery pieces, a choir of destruction that has been secretly assembled, piece by painstaking piece, under the cloak of these same quiet woods. The pine trees, which had stood as silent sentinels for a century, are turned into showers of deadly splinters. The frozen earth erupts in black fountains of mud and steel. The 19-year-old from Ohio, curled into a ball at the bottom of his hole, understands in that moment, with a terror that is absolute, that the war is not over. The war has just found him. This was the overture to Adolf Hitler's final, desperate symphony of destruction, an operation born of delusion and despair codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. Across a 70-mile front, 250,000 German soldiers and more than 1,000 tanks and assault guns, the last great reserve of the Third Reich, were surging forward into the weakest point of the Allied line. It was a phantom army, an army the Allies believed no longer existed. Intelligence reports had assured the High Command that the Wehrmacht was broken, incapable of launching any significant offensive action. The men in the Ardennes were a mix of green troops fresh off the boat and combat-weary veterans sent to what was supposed to be a quiet place to catch their breath. They were unprepared. They were outnumbered, in some places 10 to 1, and they were caught in the teeth of a blizzard, both of steel and of snow. To understand the sheer audacity of the gamble, one must step back and see the map as Hitler saw it in the winter of 1944. His 1,000-year Reich was cracking at the seams. From the east, the Soviet juggernaut was grinding relentlessly toward Berlin, a red tide of men and machines hungry for vengeance. From the west, the Anglo-American armies, having broken out of the Normandy hedgerows, had swept across France and now stood poised at the borders of the fatherland itself. German cities were being pounded into rubble by day and by night. The war was lost. Any rational military mind could see it. The generals saw it. They pleaded with Hitler to withdraw, to consolidate his forces, to defend the Rhine. But Hitler did not deal in military rationality. He dealt in Wagnerian acts of will, in grand pronouncements and world-altering gambles. He believed the alliance between the democratic West and the communist Soviet Union was a fragile, unnatural thing. He was convinced that one spectacular, devastating blow against the Americans and the British would shatter their morale, fracture their coalition, and force them to the negotiating table. He would then be free to turn all his remaining might against Stalin in the East. His plan was a carbon copy of the triumph of 1940. A massive armored thrust through the same Ardennes forest that had been the gateway to victory 4 years earlier. The panzers would punch through the thin American lines, race to the Meuse River, and then pivot north, seizing the massive, indispensable Allied supply port of Antwerp. In one swift stroke, he would cut off and encircle 4 complete Allied armies. It would be, he promised his generals, another Dunkirk, a catastrophe so profound that it would end the war in the West. The secrecy and deception required to assemble this force were nothing short of masterful. All radio traffic ceased. Orders were delivered by hand. Hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles moved only in the dead of night, hiding in the dense forests by day, their tracks covered, their engines muffled. The Allies, lulled into a false sense of security by their own success and the seemingly broken state of the German army, saw nothing. Their reconnaissance planes flew over silent, snow-covered woods, never detecting the steel serpent coiling just beneath the trees. But this serpent had a fatal hidden weakness, a flaw so fundamental it rendered the entire colossal undertaking an act of pure desperation. The German war machine was running on fumes. For months, Allied bombers had been systematically obliterating Germany's synthetic fuel plants. The Luftwaffe was grounded. Panzer divisions in training were sometimes forced to use teams of oxen to tow their tanks on the practice field. Hitler's great armored spearhead was being launched with only enough fuel in its tanks to get partway to the Meuse River. The entire plan, the fate of every soldier, every tank, the last hope of the Third Reich, rested on a single critical assumption: that they would capture the massive American fuel dumps located behind the front lines. The panzers were not just weapons of war, they were siphons. They were predators sent out to hunt not just the enemy, but the enemy's gasoline. Every German commander, from the field marshals down to the tank crews, knew this terrible truth. Their logbooks told the story not in gallons, but in kilometers. They had fuel for 50, maybe 100 kilometers. After that, their fearsome Tiger and Panther tanks would become nothing more than 4 dozen tons of immobile, indefensible steel. The grandest offensive of the war was, at its heart, a heist, a desperate scramble for gas. And as the initial assault shattered the American lines, as terrified GIs fled or were captured by the hundreds, it seemed for a few terrifying days as if the gamble might just pay off. But history rarely turns on grand pronouncements. More often, it pivots on small unforeseen moments, on the stubbornness of a few men in a forgotten town, or on something as mundane, as utterly insignificant as a single 5-gallon jerrycan of fuel. To understand the scale of the gamble, one must first look not at the grand strategy maps in Hitler's bunker, but at the guts of the machines themselves. The centerpiece of this armored thrust, the Panzerkampfwagen Tiger Ausführung B, or King Tiger, was a 75-ton behemoth of interlocking steel plate. It was propelled by a masterpiece of engineering, the Maybach HL230P30 engine, a 23-liter V12 gasoline engine that produced 700 horsepower. But to generate that power, it consumed fuel at a rate that was, even by the standards of the day, breathtakingly inefficient. On a perfectly flat paved road, the King Tiger would burn through nearly 500 liters of gasoline to cover 100 kilometers. That's less than half a mile per gallon, but the Ardennes in winter was not a paved road. It was a labyrinth of icy inclines, snow-choked mud, and twisting forest trails. In these conditions, with the engine screaming in low gear, fuel consumption could easily double, reaching over 1,000 liters per 100 kilometers, an entire metric ton of gasoline just to move one tank 62 miles. Its internal fuel tanks held 860 liters, giving it a theoretical maximum combat range of just over 100 kilometers, a journey it would never, in reality, achieve. And the King Tiger was not alone. It was accompanied by the formidable Panther tank. At 45 tons, it was lighter, but it mounted the very same Maybach engine. Its consumption was better, but still ferocious. Nearly 300 liters per 100 kilometers on road and well over 700 off-road. Then came the Panzerviehs, the self-propelled assault guns, the armored half-tracks like the Stecki FZ 251, and the thousands of Opel Blitz and Krupp Protzer trucks needed to carry ammunition, food, and, most ironically, the reserve fuel itself. Each of these vehicles was a thirsty mouth to feed. An Opel Blitz truck, the logistical workhorse of the Wehrmacht, required 40 liters for every 100 kilometers. A single panzer division, at full strength, could require over 30,000 gallons, or 115,000 liters, of fuel for a single day of moderate combat operations. The 6th Panzer Army alone, the main effort of the offensive, comprised 4 full SS Panzer divisions. The math was not just daunting, it was apocalyptic. The German High Command calculated that the entire operation, from the jump-off points to the final objective of Antwerp, would require a minimum of 30 million litres of gasoline. What they managed to scrape together from the dregs of the Reich's reserves was just over 18 million litres. A staggering deficit of 12 million litres, more than 3 million gallons. This entire gap, the chasm between victory and annihilation, was to be filled by what the operational orders euphemistically called captured enemy stocks. The plan was not a military strategy so much as a set of instructions for a bank robbery, where the getaway cars had only enough gas to get to the bank. The quality of the fuel they did have was another hidden variable of failure. Allied strategic bombing had systematically leveled the hydrogenation plants that produced Germany's high-octane synthetic gasoline. What now filled the jerrycans was often low-grade brown coal gasoline, a product of the Fischer-Tropsch process that was notoriously inconsistent. Its lower octane rating fouled spark plugs, caused engine knocking, and reduced the already anemic performance of the overstressed Maybach power plants. The engines were not just thirsty. They were being slowly poisoned from within. The delivery of this precious toxic fuel to the front was a nightmare of its own. It was a journey through a hierarchy of containers. It arrived at railheads in massive tanker cars, where it was painstakingly decanted into 200-litre drums. From there, it was loaded onto trucks and driven down clogged, narrow roads designated as Rollbahnen, which quickly devolved into frozen parking lots of steel. But the final, most crucial link in this chain was the Wehrmacht Einheitskanister, the 20-litre canister that the Allies would copy and call the jerrycan. This simple, stamped metal can was a marvel of design. 3 handles allowed it to be carried by one man or passed between 2 in a human chain. An air pocket ensured it would float in water and allowed for expansion and contraction. Its spout was recessed and had a short pore nozzle, eliminating the need for a funnel. But its efficiency highlighted the sheer inefficiency of the task. To refuel a single Panther tank from empty required 36 of these cans. A King Tiger needed 43. A 5-man tank crew, exhausted and freezing, would have to manually hoist nearly a ton of fuel, can by can, into their vehicle, all while being priority targets for enemy artillery and aircraft. While the machines were starving, so were the men. The human body is also an engine, governed by the laws of thermodynamics. A soldier engaged in heavy combat in sub-freezing temperatures can burn upwards of 5,000 calories a day. The official daily ration for a German soldier on the front line in late 1944 was, on paper, around 3,000 calories, but what was actually delivered was often far less. A typical meal might be a slice of dense dark bread, a piece of sausage, and a thin vegetable soup. This was a diet of slow starvation. It induced fatigue, slowed reaction times, and degraded a soldier's ability to resist the debilitating cold. In contrast, the American GI was the best-fed soldier in the world. His K rations and C rations, while monotonous, were scientifically designed to provide over 3,500 calories, packed with the fats and sugars needed for high-energy output. The German offensive was being powered by men running a significant and growing calorie deficit, a biological parallel to the fuel deficit plaguing their machines. The entire organism of the German army, from its steel skin to its human heart, was running on empty. And just a few dozen miles away from their sputtering advance lay the prize, the vast American fuel dumps around the towns of Spa and Stavelot in Belgium. They contained millions upon millions of gallons of high-octane gasoline, a treasure beyond imagining for the fuel-starved panzers. It was all there, enough to get them to the Meuse, to Antwerp, and perhaps, they dreamed, to victory. All they had to do was get there. But between them and that ocean of fuel lay a few stubborn American soldiers, a series of blown bridges, and the brutal, unyielding arithmetic of the empty gas tank. For the men of Kampfgruppe Piper, this brutal arithmetic was becoming a death sentence, written not in ink, but in frost and hunger. For Oberscharführer Josef Gärtner, commander of a Panzer IV, the world had shrunk to the needle on his fuel gauge. It had been hovering on empty for the last hour, a silent mockery of the powerful Maybach engine that now sputtered and coughed with a final metallic sigh. His tank, a 25-ton steel Predator, rolled to a halt in a snow-choked lane somewhere west of La Glaise. Silence descended, a heavy blanket broken only by the whistling of the wind through the bare trees and the chattering of his gunner's teeth. They were now a pillbox, a static target, their famed mobility just a memory. And they were cold. The kind of cold that steel transmits directly into a man's bones, a deep, invasive chill that no amount of shivering could dislodge. Inside the cramped turret, the five-man crew huddled together, their breath crystallizing in the frigid air. Their rations for the day had been a single tin of preserved meat, shared 5 ways, and a piece of bread so hard it had to be gnawed like a bone. Joseph watched his loader, a boy of 18 named Eric, try to break a piece off with the butt of his pistol. The bread shattered like slate, the frozen crumbs scattering across the greasy floor. Eric stared at the pieces for a long moment, his face a mask of exhaustion and despair, before slowly, painstakingly, picking them up one by one. This was the glorious spearhead of the German army, not conquerors, but scavengers in a frozen tomb of their own making. The fuel for their bodies was as scarce as the fuel for their machine. Outside, the Ardennes forest was waiting. It didn't care about their orders, their ideology, or their dreams of Antwerp. It only cared about the laws of nature, and nature was slowly, methodically freezing them to death. The infantrymen who accompanied the tanks fared even worse. They had no steel shell to protect them from the wind, no engine to provide a fleeting moment of warmth. For Gefreiter Hans Vogel, a 17-year-old drafted into a Volksgrenadier division just 6 weeks prior, the war had ceased to be about grand strategy or the fatherland. The war had shrunk to the universe contained within his worn leather boots. His feet had been wet for 3 days. Now they were simply numb, 2 blocks of unfeeling ice at the ends of his legs. He no longer dared to take his boots off, terrified of what he might find, of the skin sloughing off, of the black rot of frostbite he'd seen on other men. He and his squad huddled in a shallow ditch, their summer-issue greatcoats offering pitiful protection against the sub-zero temperatures. Their squad leader, a hardened veteran from the Russian front, showed them how to stuff their coats with straw and newspaper for insulation, a pathetic defense against the biting cold. Their hunger was a physical presence, a hollow ache that twisted their insides. The field kitchens were miles behind, bogged down on the same icy roads that had halted the panzers. The day's meal was a thin soup made from melted snow and a few desiccated vegetables. Hans watched as a man in his squad, delirious with hunger, began to eat handfuls of snow. The sergeant slapped it out of his hand. "Idiot," he hissed, his voice raw. "That will only freeze your gut and kill you faster." The man simply stared back, his eyes vacant before slumping back against the frozen earth. There was no fight left in him. He wasn't surrendering to the Americans. He was surrendering to the cold. Hans looked from the man's vacant face towards the dark line of American positions. He wondered if they were warm. He imagined them sitting around a fire, drinking hot coffee, opening cans of meat and fruit cocktail. The thought was not born of hatred, but of a profound soul-crushing envy. Ammunition, like food and fuel, was a dwindling resource. At a machine gun nest overlooking a crucial crossroads, a corporal named Steiner carefully counted the rounds in his last belt of ammunition for the MG-42. 250 rounds. In a sustained firefight, the weapon's blistering rate of fire could burn through that in less than 30 seconds. His orders were absolute: fire only on confirmed targets in short, controlled bursts. The profligate freedom of the early war, of hosing down entire tree lines, was a luxury as distant as a warm bed. Now, every single bullet was a precious jewel to be spent with the utmost care. He could hear the enemy, the murmur of American voices, the clank of equipment. They were close. The tension was unbearable. To hold fire while the enemy advanced was against every instinct he possessed. His finger trembled on the trigger. He was being asked to fight a war of abundance with the tools of scarcity. He felt a rising tide of futility. Each carefully aimed shot was just a delay of the inevitable. The Americans had endless belts of ammunition, endless trucks of food, endless oceans of fuel. He had one belt, an empty stomach, and a growing certainty that he would die right here, in this frozen hole in the ground. The physical toll was mirrored by a psychological collapse. The initial euphoria of the surprise attack, the belief that they could truly turn the tide of the war, had evaporated in the face of the cold, the mud, and the relentless shortages. It was replaced by a sullen, silent resignation. Men who had fought with fanaticism in Normandy and Russia now moved with the slow, shuffling gait of the defeated. They saw their magnificent King Tigers, the most powerful tanks in the world, abandoned by the roadside, out of gas. They saw their comrades fall not to enemy bullets, but to exposure and starvation. The propaganda about a swift, decisive blow felt like a cruel joke. The only thing swift and decisive was the frostbite that claimed a man's fingers and toes. The only thing that mattered anymore was the next rumor of a supply drop, the next chance for a piece of bread, the next opportunity to find shelter from the wind. The great organism of the German army was not just running on empty. Its very soul was freezing over. Each starving soldier, each stranded tanker, each man counting his last few rounds was a single dying cell in a body consuming itself from the inside out. And so the great dying body of the German 6th Panzer Army made its final lunge. The very tip of this spear, its most vital and lethal cell, was an armored column commanded by a man named Joachim Peiper. His Kampfgruppe was a mailed fist of Panther and King Tiger tanks, a concentration of destructive power that had torn a bloody swathe through the American lines. For days they had been the stuff of nightmares, a ghost legion moving through the snow-shrouded forests, appearing where they were least expected, leaving ruin in their wake. They were the fulfillment of the Führer's desperate gambler's throw, the living embodiment of the offensive's promise. They pushed on, deeper and deeper into the quiet lands of Belgium, until they were a mere handful of miles from the Meuse River, the great artery that, if crossed, could bleed the Allied armies dry. Their objective was so close, they could almost feel the vibration of the endless Allied supply trucks that rumbled just beyond the next ridge. So close they could almost smell the victory they had been promised. And then, the lunge stopped. It did not end in a blaze of glory, in a climactic battle of steel and fire that would be sung about for 1,000 years. It ended with a cough, a sputter, a shudder that ran through a 60-ton tank, followed by an immense, profound silence. One by one, the engines of the most feared armored force on Earth fell quiet. The deep, throaty growl of the Maybachs died in the frozen air, replaced by the whisper of the wind through the fir trees. The spearhead of the entire Ardennes offensive had ground to a halt, not because of a wall of enemy guns, but because of an empty needle on a fuel gauge. All the fanaticism, all the training, all the will that had propelled them this far now meant nothing. The war machine had starved. The fate of an army, the final hope of a dying empire, was sealed not by a general's masterstroke, but by the simple, brutal arithmetic of consumption. It all came down to the last 5 gallons of fuel that weren't there. For Peiper's men, trapped near a village called L'Église, the silence was more terrifying than the thunder of any artillery barrage. They were titans, trapped in statues of steel. They sat in their cold iron tombs, looking out at a world that was now their prison. They waited for the fuel trucks that their commanders swore were coming. But the fuel trucks were just as stranded, miles back, on roads choked with wreckage and desperation. The hunters had become the hunted. The American forces, battered and reeling only days before, now began to slowly, methodically close the noose. Peiper and his men, the elite of the Waffen-SS, were reduced to siphoning the last dregs of gasoline from knocked-out vehicles, fighting over mere cupfuls. Finally, the realization dawned. The panzers were not weapons anymore. They were monuments to a colossal failure. In a final humiliating act, Peiper gave the order. They would destroy their own magnificent machines, the pride of the Reich, and try to walk home. The sight of these elite soldiers setting demolition charges on their own King Tigers, turning their steel gods into flaming pyres, was the true and final surrender. It was the moment the dream of victory died, not in a bunker in Berlin, but right there, in a muddy, frozen field in Belgium. When the spring thaw finally came, it was as if the land itself was exhaling a long-held breath of sorrow. The snow melted not to reveal the green promise of new life, but to uncover a vast, silent graveyard. The Ardennes forest had become a museum of a dead army. Everywhere, the ghosts of the offensive remained, frozen in their last moment of ambition. A column of Panther tanks sat silent on a narrow road, their long guns still pointing west towards a river they would never reach. A half-track was discovered with its crew still inside, slumped over in the postures of sleep, claimed not by a bullet, but by the unforgiving cold. The forest floor was a tapestry of abandonment, discarded rifles half sunk in the mud, helmets riddled with shrapnel, stacks of ammunition crates whose contents would never be fired, and the bodies. The melting snow gave up the dead, preserved by the winter's ice. They lay in the awkward poses of their final moments, their faces pale and placid. The land, which had been a silent witness to the fury, now held them in its cold embrace, making no distinction between the grey uniform and the olive drab. For years afterward, the forest remembered. The people who returned to their shattered villages lived within the shadow of the battle. Farmers tilling their fields would turn up the rusted teeth of a tank tread, a soldier's canteen, a shard of bone. Children playing in the woods would stumble upon the deep, water-filled craters of artillery shells, or the collapsed remains of a foxhole slowly being reclaimed by moss and ivy. The trees themselves bore the scars, their ancient bark peppered with shrapnel, their trunks twisted where the fire had passed. The battle was over, but it had seeped into the soil, into the water, into the very memory of the place. It became a story the land itself would tell, whispered in the rustle of leaves, in the quiet drip of water in a dark ravine. It was a story not of heroes and villains, but of a great and terrible storm that had passed, leaving a silence that was deeper and more lasting than any thunder. In the end, Hitler's final offensive was not defeated by a single act of bravery or a brilliant tactical maneuver. It was defeated by logistics. It was defeated by oceans of oil from Texas and assembly lines from Detroit. It was a war of systems, and the German system, built on a philosophy of lightning conquest and the supremacy of will, simply ran out of fuel. That is the final stark lesson of the Ardennes. A war machine, no matter how advanced or how fearsome, is still just a machine. It needs to be fed. The belief that fury and fanaticism could be a substitute for gasoline was the ultimate delusion. The forest has healed now. The trees have grown tall, their canopy covering the old wounds in the earth. But the ghosts are still there. They linger as a quiet reminder that the grandest strategies of men, the most terrible ambitions of empires, can be brought to a sudden, sputtering halt by something as simple and as vital as a few missing gallons of fuel.